Hello everybody, my name is John McAuliffe and I'm going to start with just a few of the practical details about what we're doing here today. First of all, welcome to those of you who are here in the hall at the Whitworth, and welcome also to those of you who are joining us on the live stream this afternoon. As well as live streaming this event, we are also going to take the recording of the event and make it available shortly afterwards. And you'll have seen that we also have a photographer present today. I've been asked to tell you that we're not expecting a fire alarm, so if you hear one, it will be real. Our stewards are dotted around the room in purple tops, and they will lead the evacuation via the nearest exit to a safe assembly point outside. This event is presented by Creative Manchester in partnership with the Global Inequalities Research Beacon at the University of Manchester, and we would like to thank also our friends at the Whitworth for hosting us today. After the panel discussion, there will be time for you to ask questions at the end, but I've also been asked, because of the live stream, that you wait until a microphone comes to you before asking a question. We also appreciate that some of the subjects that we're going to be discussing at the event relate to sensitive and painful material, which we will handle as carefully as possible. The aim of this event is to help to support our communities in the face of injustice. And there is a quiet, reflective room away from the hall. So if at any point anybody feels distressed, please raise your hand and a steward will be able to assist you and to take you to that space. So, Creative Manchester is one of our university's research platforms, which means that we work with our university's brilliant researchers to develop collaborative workers or to work with partners outside the university. The university has recently been recognized as a global leader for its commitment to social responsibility as a driver for research. I am going to hand over in a minute to one of my colleagues whose work and commitment to impactful research has been inspiring to many of us. David Olusoga is Professor of Public History here at the University of Manchester. He received an OBE for his services to history and community integration in 2019. The best-selling author of many books, he also works as a producer and presenter of some of the defining series and documentaries of the past decade, including House Through Time, Black and British, and the BAFTA award-winning Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners. David will introduce and chair the discussion, where he will be joined by, in order of appearance, Nazir Afzal, author of 2 books, The Prosecutor, and this year, The Race to the Top, Structural Racism and How to Fight It. Nazir is also incoming Chancellor of the University of Manchester. Roxy Lagan, who is the Director of Kids of Colour, a PhD student at Manchester Metropolitan University, and the author recently of a brilliant essay for Red Pepper on the relative legal standing of harm and care. Jan Cunniff, who is one of the co-founders of the campaign group Jengba, which stands for Joint Enterprise Not Guilty by Association, and Ethna Quinn, who is Professor of American Studies at Manchester and who has worked as an expert witness on the use of rap music and related expressive culture as incriminating evidence. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Olusoga.
Thank you very much for coming. We're here to discuss the law. We're here to discuss particularly joint enterprise and conspiracy laws and the impact that they've been having on our communities. And we'll be exploring some highly controversial cases, including cases that will be personal to people in this room. One of those cases took place here in Manchester, in which several black teenagers were found guilty by association after prosecutors used social media and references to drill music lyrics and videos to build a case against them. It was thus claimed that they were affiliated with a gang, and the concept and the construct of the gang is something we will be discussing and drilling into. But this case crystallizes broader trends in these group prosecutions. To discuss this, we have an eminent panel, and we're going to begin with each of the panelists giving us a 5 minutes or a little bit longer outline of the work that they do, their relationship to these laws and to this situation that we find ourselves in relation to them. So I'd like to ask my panelists to join me up on the stage. There's no formal seating plan, so wherever we like.
There's a microphone here,
So we're going to start the opening remarks with Nazir Afzal, who, as John said, is the incoming Chancellor of the University of Manchester, and he's written extensively on the law.
Good afternoon. Oh my God, it works. Thank you so much, David, and thank you very much indeed to all of you for coming this afternoon. In a former life, I was the Chief Crown Prosecutor for the North West of England, and before that, I was Director of Prosecutions in London, and I spent 25 years in prosecuting crime throughout the 90s and the 2000s. Then more recently, well, 5 years ago, I was Chief Executive of the country's Police and Crime Commissioners. So I've spent a career in working in justice and working to tackle some of the most serious and horrible things that human beings do to other human beings. But on this particular subject, I struggle to recall any case that I've ever dealt with that might fall within the definition that you're discussing today. But I thought if I give you a little bit of a, yes, I am a lawyer, but I'm not on the role of lawyer, so I'm not a lawyer here today, okay? So don't trust my law. And secondly, the law did change 5-6 years ago, specifically by the Supreme Court, so I'll touch on that a little bit. What we're talking about here, joint enterprise, which is no, it's not up there. Joint enterprise, which is the concept that we're dealing with, is long established. It's hundreds of years old. It works around the world, and what it basically means is that more than one person comes together with the same intent to commit a particular crime. So you'll all be familiar with it when it comes to, say, armed robbery. You break into a bank, you have a getaway driver outside, you have somebody who may have cased the joint. Those two may not actually be in the bank, but they were just as guilty as the people who were in the bank to commit the crime. So you'll understand that. It's different. Somebody mentioned earlier on conspiracy. You may be familiar with the word conspiracy, particularly in sort of fake news concept, but this is not conspiracy. Joint enterprise is not conspiracy. Conspiracy is a specific crime where people have agreed to commit a crime. What we're talking about here is when you have a principal offender, so somebody who, for example, has carried out the murder, and you have other persons who are said to have assisted or encouraged them in some way. And this is where it gets complicated. So, as I said a moment ago, joint enterprise itself is a principle well established and will undoubtedly continue for the foreseeable future. What we're talking about is how you prove joint enterprise. And as you've heard earlier on, there are lots of examples which are currently being used. You heard drill videos being mentioned. You heard about association in terms of gang membership, all of which are potentially evidence that could demonstrate that you had the same intent as the principal offender, the person who carries out the crime. So the one case I dealt with in London was at Victoria Station in the Underground, where 10 young men stormed in, for want of a better term, and one individual was stabbed to death, and the other nine disappeared. And it was all caught on CCTV, and there was... so the question then was, what was the responsibility of the 9 other people other than the one that actually committed the crime? Now, the law, as it stood then, was that because they were present, because they were shouting, shank him, kill him, that they had a responsibility that was shared with the individual that actually carried out the act, and therefore they too should be found guilty of murder or potentially manslaughter, depending on the circumstances. But there are other offences, so violent disorder. There are other offences less serious than homicide, murder, which potentially could be charged in that scenario. Now, what's been happening, what happened in the Supreme Court case 6 years ago was the Supreme Court were asked to look at this issue about what your level of culpability, what blame attaches to you if you are in the same group as somebody that commits a crime. And what the Supreme Court said is the law had become a little bit lax over the years, and what had begun to happen was that simply your presence in the group was sufficient to demonstrate your responsibility for the crime that was carried out by the principal offender. And the Supreme Court said, well, that's not right. Your presence is something that could be used in evidence, but it shouldn't be presumed that because you were in that group that you share the guilt of the principal offender. So that was quite a significant change. The reality, of course, is, and I bow to the knowledge of more experienced individuals the last few years, is the law hasn't changed a great deal. In actual fact, that's still happening, that your presence, even though it might simply be, I hate to use the word innocent, you were present, that's still being used against suspects in terms of making them as guilty as the principal offender. And I think that's the issue here as to whether or not that should happen, and secondly, what evidence should be used to demonstrate that. And of course, we've touched on drill videos and the language that's used in social media and online. The easy ones are where you've got CCTV and you've been able to capture what everybody says, but when you're talking about evidence of association, I've learned from others, the issue is what evidence is put before a court. Now, you've had instances of experts giving evidence on behalf of the prosecution, and these experts happen to be police officers who've spent years, apparently, looking at drill videos and have formed a view about what these videos mean, and therefore what potentially would lead to be used in court. And of course, the more general issue, given we're talking about race, is that if you're a black person, you are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white person. You are more likely to be arrested, you're more likely to be charged, you're more likely to be convicted, you're more likely to be sentenced than a white person on exactly the same evidence. So the idea that there's no racism in the system is an absolute nonsense. It's something that is deeply ingrained in the system. And that means that when you have situations like this, what's happening? Now, prosecutors will turn around and say, well, we didn't decide, the jury decided. That's you, 12 members, random members of the public, selected to make a judgment on a particular case. And therefore, that sort of absolves them of responsibility. It absolves the police of responsibility because they let the public decide. However, the public are prejudiced too. And so when you present evidence before a court, you should do so in such a way that addresses the prejudices and says to them that just because young black men walk together doesn't mean that they're all guilty of the same crime committed by the offender. And of course, there are some serious issues, as you're going about to hear, about whether the system is fit for purpose in the 21st century. But as I said a moment ago, the concept of joint enterprise, long established, works effectively. What we are talking about is the evidence that is used to demonstrate that. And as I said a moment ago, the system itself, sadly, is racist.
Nazir, thank you very much for those opening remarks. I'd now like to turn to Roxy Lagan, who, as you heard, has been giving a lot of thought and doing a lot of research into specifically these cases here in Manchester.
Hi, everyone. This is quite hard for me today, so I just want to put that out there. If it takes me a bit longer than 5 minutes, bear with me. It's still quite a traumatizing situation, not just for me, but for people in the room who know the boys as well. It wasn't really research, it was kind of youth work and supporting young people that I know and grew to know as well. So I'd just like to start by saying a happy birthday to one of the boys who was the 10th defendant in the case that I'm going to talk about. He turns 20 today. He was at university, but sadly the case that took kind of 3 months to go through court meant that he got suspended from university and obviously then was sentenced to 8 years for his part in the collective punishment, so therefore couldn't continue his degree. But yeah, I just want to recognise that it's his birthday today. And I also want to recognise Jengba and thank them, because I don't think many of us would be in this room if it wasn't for the work that they do. Many wouldn't even know about what joint enterprise is, so just a thank you to them as well. So just a quick show of hands, how many people in this room know a bit about the case, the Manchester 10 case that I'm going to speak about? Okay, so a fair few, just so I know what level of detail. I just want to make clear that when we talk about collective punishment, we're often highlighting the injustice of those who have been sent to prison for harms that they didn't commit. And that is a very real injustice that we need to speak about here today. But I think it's really important that we don't other those who have committed harm. For me, if a young person, and if any person, but I'm a youth worker, so if a young person harms in our society, something has gone wrong with our society, but it's easy to scapegoat that one person in collective punishment cases. In this case of the Manchester 10, only one young person committed direct harm. And his story through this indictment period that was talked about in court showed that he was struggling with grief after the loss of a very close friend. He had been there at that loss. It was very traumatic. And in a peak moment of his grief, before he'd committed any harm, he was excluded from his college. So there are always failures in people's stories, okay, when people go on to commit harm. And those are often systemic, and they're about the society that we live in. So to touch on the case, the Manchester 10, I'm calling it that because it's just an easy way to summarise it, but 10 boys, one all black, one caused direct harm, and both faced 2 counts of conspiracy to murder and conspiracy to GBH. Following the loss of a friend that they all knew in different and disconnected ways, 2 days later, there was a Telegram chat. And then, following the Telegram chat, so the Telegram chat happened on the 8th of November. On November 10th, there was a non-harmful chase at a college. Later on December 16th, there was an incident of harm that included 2 of the boys in this case. And then in December 28th, there was another harm that included 1 of those boys and 3 other boys that we don't even know who they are. But this harm and this experience is what the gang starts to be constructed around. So, as we can see through Patrick Williams and Becky Clark's research into joint enterprise and gangs, we know that the gang narrative is more likely to be used in prosecution when those defendants are black. We know that this is a highly racialized and racist narrative. Once these cases take place, as the Manchester 10's case took place, it's then confirmed in the media, right, soon after. Gang has gone to prison. That confirms to the public that there is a gang problem, despite the fact that we know these boys are not a gang and they continue to resist this in court. So the public goes on to believe, as part of this moral panic, that there is a continual gang problem, and that again allows the narrative to be reused in the prosecution and so on, which is why it's so important for us to challenge that gang narrative in all the work we do, whether that's with young people or beyond. A lawyer recently told me that gang cases for black boys can no longer be won in court. She said that it feels as if juries have become more racist, that the only places that the case can be won is pre-trial, by challenging lots of the racist narrative, doing all the subject access requests on what the police even have to show that these boys are a gang, or post-trial in the appeal. But if we let these cases get to court, for black boys who are facing a gang narrative, they have not got a chance. And that is an experienced lawyer in London who's working on these issues. The way the gang narrative was constructed in this case was boy 1, and I won't name those other than those that I know would be comfortable with me naming them. Boy 1, who was the only boy to commit harm in the case of the Manchester 10, is a rapper. And that was very handy for the prosecution, because he rapped in a music collective called M40, the same M40 that H, hands up if we know H in the room, mix, very well-known kind of grime artist, drill, both pop now really, no shade to H, but H has also kind of come from that M40 name. You'll see in his Instagram videos, he graffitis it. It's a very kind of well-known music collective, right? But the question that was then put to the jury and the narrative that was then made firm by the prosecution was, is this a gang or is this a music collective? We're saying that M40 is one of the most dangerous gangs in North Manchester. Now, they utilise their music videos, and that will come on to be discussed in lyrics and things like that, but they utilise their music videos to say, see, the boys are in blue. They're in blue, so it means that they're a gang, because blue is the M40 gang colour. They don't have to prove that, they can just say it. and it's true. So that means then if they could find a photo of any of the boys separately in blue, that was a signifier of them being a gang member, even if it was a blue Arsenal shirt. Okay, so they used things like that. They used lyrics that were drill lyrics written sometimes about some of the events that were included in the case, but some of those young people just rapping about hearsay. But they used drill lyrics that had very commonly used kind of themes of violence to say that these are inherently violent young people, and if you rap and if you're part of the music collective, then you're part of the gang. The M40 do have a song called No Hook that is watched by thousands and hundreds of thousands of people on YouTube, but that became something that was utilised to say that actually a boy further down the defendant list, whose only evidence was a Telegram chat, because he had that music video on his phone, he must be a gang member. And sadly, also what happened here is the boy, their friend, who was sadly killed, became head of the M40 gang, because he also rapped. So whilst he's not here to defend that narrative, suddenly in court, in the Manchester Evening News headlines, he becomes leader of the M40 gang. And the narrative becomes that these boys were trying to get revenge for their gang leader's death. Okay? Now, these boys all knew each other in differing ways, and some of them had not even met before they shared a doc. So how they then start to stream that down is the Telegram chat I mentioned. This Telegram chat happened 2 days after their friend was murdered. It quickly became the idea that if you were invited to the chat, you were a gang member. So the person who created the group only invited known gang members, despite the fact that they were joining because they believed it was a memorial chat created for their friend. And in that Telegram chat, they did say some stuff that, as youth workers, we'd need to challenge, and we'd need to say, what's going on here? But what we'd say is, it's very clear that you're grieving. Let's take this elsewhere. Some of those young people went a little bit further in what they were saying, but some who were lower down the defendant list said things like, they live in Oldham, and then sent 2 other messages, and that was it. That was it in the whole case, and now he serves 8 years in prison. 4 of those boys, the only evidence was the Telegram chat, and a few messages within that Telegram chat that were constructed as kind of this gang activity and gang planning. And the others were drawn in through, in the middle of the defendant list, were drawn in through their music, their want to be in music videos, and because of the nature of drill, there were some young people who kind of had photos with weapons and things like that as part of that kind of artistic creation. And of course, then you get to the top of the list where actually one boy did commit harm. And I think using him, they were able to then pull in everyone else, but also pulling in everyone else also had a negative impact for him, as opposed to us just viewing him as one young person who was actually grieving really badly after the loss of a friend. So the ability to draw the net also based off the fact that they had connections on social media. Of course they did. These boys went to school together. They went to church together. Some of them played basketball together. So they managed to weave this net that became a strong gang narrative. So I'm sure we'll talk more about it in the panel, but some things to say about conspiracy charges. So conspiracy was really useful here, and Jan will talk about joint enterprise, and often you'll see that used in kind of murder cases. Conspiracy was really useful here in a case where there was no murder. You don't have to prove violence in conspiracy charges. You just have to prove that there was a discussion. So 4, in the end, were found guilty of conspiracy to murder, and 6 were found guilty of conspiracy to GBH. And what's scary about the use of conspiracy is no murder needs to occur, but when it got to sentencing, it was attempted murder guidelines that were used to sentence those who were found guilty on murder. So they are serving over 20 years in prison. Through this case, it was never clear who they conspired to murder. So no one that was named in the Telegram chat ever came to any harm. So the people who came to harm were nothing to do with any of the discussions had that were then utilised to say, actually, there's a discussion here there is a conspiracy. And I think what was also extremely scary about this case is that to prove conspiracy, there has to be an agreement made. There has to be a clear agreement. But if you just looked at that Telegram chat, and I am coming to an end, sorry if I've been over 5 minutes. If you just look at that Telegram chat, you can see quite clearly that there was no agreement in it. There was absolutely no agreement. It was boys chatting grief, getting angry, disjointed, immature, whatever. There was no agreement in it. So the prosecution said, this is the conspiracy in action. The agreement was actually made between the 5th, when their friend died, and the 8th, when the Telegram chat was made. We can't tell you when and where, and we won't prove that there was an agreement in that time, but that there was an agreement that was made there. This discussion is just the conspiracy in action, because they knew if you looked at that chat, you would leave saying there was no agreement from some of those boys to do anything. So they allude to this space where an agreement has happened, but they never had to prove it. So collectively, these boys got 131 years. And I think what I'd finally like to say is these kind of charges, conspiracy, joint enterprise, the doctrine of joint enterprise, collective punishment, is not an accident. It's not just if we just finally get to show someone that this is a bad thing that's happening, it will stop. We're with a government who are increasing prison sentences. They are building new prisons. They're building secure schools as a charity endeavour. This is not an accident, it is purposeful, and the easiest way to fill those places is by collective punishment in our communities. I'll end there. Thank you.
Roxy, thank you very much for that. I'd just like to reiterate that we are painfully aware that this discussion is very personal for many people in this room. I'd like to reiterate that there is a place to go if things become difficult for you. So please do put your hand up if that becomes the case. Roxy mentioned in her opening remarks Jengba, and I'd like to turn to Jan, who is the co-founder of Jengba. Please tell us about that organisation and about your story in relation to these laws.
Back in 2007, both my sons were charged with murder. They were 15 years old. I'll try and make this as brief as possible, but they were both charged. I went to the police station. I sat through the interviews with both of them. I'm not a detective, but it became really clear straight away that neither of my two children had murdered anyone. We went to trial. The trial happened within 3 months of the incident, which I thought was quite bizarre, but it was all over the newspapers. It was Broken Britain. This was, we were about to have a new government, and there was a fight between the Conservatives and the Labour Party who was going to be tough on crime and how to prove that they were going to be tough on crime, because look what's happening up in the northwest. We've got gangs, we've got children going around killing people, and my son's case was used as one of them. Even though neither of my children had killed anyone. The victim died because of a single blow to the neck. The boy that delivered that blow to the neck confessed to his mother in the police station, who the next day told the police about this confession. The second boy on the indictment, when he was arrested, pleaded guilty to manslaughter because he said, if the punch that I gave him before the kick arrived led to his death, then I am guilty of manslaughter. That's kind of how the law works, isn't it? However, they arrested and charged a third boy and my two sons. We went through the trial process, and I thought this was about letting the victims know what happened. Let the victim's wife know what happened to her husband. Let's have a trial so it all comes out. To me, I think boy 1 and 2 should have, whatever they pleaded to should have been accepted. Or the two of them should have gone to trial. So as we're going through the trial process, I'm not seeing any evidence against either of my two children. I'm not seeing anything being said other than, and this is the phrase that got me, the possibility of foresight. Now, when we got to the end of the trial, one of my sons was acquitted, but the son that was found guilty, 3 were acquitted. The 2 that had basically confessed, the boy third on the indictment was acquitted. The one, number 5, which was my eldest son, who was 15 years old at the time, he was found guilty. And my other son, who was also 15, was acquitted. Sorry. My blind son was found guilty of murder. He was proven in the courtroom not to have laid a finger on the victim. Now, when you talk about mere presence at the scene, how can a blind person be found guilty of murder just because they're present at the scene? And it's joint enterprise, isn't it? Joint enterprise. I'd never heard of it. I Googled it. It was a hip replacement therapist in Glasgow. I went to the library and I looked at law books, tried to find out what it meant. I couldn't find anything. So we were doomed. Nobody knew what I was talking about. When I went to lawyers, when I went to the press, I went to the media because they were saying that my son was a murderer, that he was a vicious gang-membering murderer. They wouldn't listen to me because they thought I was deluded, that nobody could go to prison for life, for murder, simply because they possibly foresaw the actions of another person, even if they couldn't see that person in the first place. Well, hallelujah, yes you can. I met a lady in London called Gloria Morrison, and this happened because only one person would listen to me, which was a producer of the Panorama programme. And she'd been to court and she'd seen kind of what was going on, so she got a taste of it and really did think something was wrong. And luckily for me, she convinced the BBC to make this Panorama programme, and it took 18 months before she could convince them. And once she convinced them, and it was going to go out on TV, she introduced me to a lady called Gloria Morrison, who was also in this Panorama programme. Now, Gloria had to be in this because they couldn't do a programme simply about my son's injustice. And I'm kind of glad they didn't, because I don't think it would have made any difference anyway, because now I know more about our justice system. I know that they wouldn't have relented and given him the justice that he deserved. But I met Gloria because they couldn't do this about my son on his own because he was blind. The judge also placed a gagging order on that. So I could never tell anyone in the media, no newspaper could ever say that my son had this disability. So this programme was never going to be made. So she linked up with Gloria, and that's when the two of us met. And instantly, because of our own experience of what we'd heard about joint enterprise, we sort of looked at each other and said, we need a campaign, we need a national campaign. And that's what we did. Just two women from the kitchen sat there every night with a laptop, talking on the phone to each other. We put an advertisement in Inside Time because we just knew that if she was in London and I was in Warrington, we weren't the only two people that this had happened to. So we put an advertisement in Inside Time to all the prisoners. And within a very short period of time, we got about 200 letters from men, women, who had said, thank you, we thought no one would ever listen or understand or accept that we haven't killed anyone. We were the first people that they'd come in contact with who were talking about injustice and understanding what had happened to them. Now, that was over 10 years ago. We now have, I think it's 1,490. Some of those are children as young as 12 years old. Some of our cases, it'll be an adult that commits the crime, but a child will still get a life sentence for murder. And one of the things that really got me the most when my son was convicted of murder, even though the trial proved he murdered no one, but his possibility of foresight meant that he could have foresaw what someone else who didn't know what they were going to do would do it anyway. To put a child in prison for life for that, and we are talking 99 years, is an abomination. We are the only country in Europe that still puts children in prison for life. But even worse, we put children who haven't committed the crime in prison for life. And I think this is really important that everyone in this room right now, regardless of what you think about joint enterprise, you should be saying, why are we giving children life sentences? Even if you agree with joint enterprise, why are we doing this? And I think another thing I want to add on what was said earlier about the law actually took a wrong turn in 1984. And the reason we have the Supreme Court judgment is because one of our cases managed to get to the Supreme Court. It wasn't one of our best cases. There were a lot more cases that could have got there and really made the law more solid. But Amin Jogi was acquitted of murder, and then he went to trial for manslaughter. So he was convicted a second time, but as a secondary party to murder, which means you don't get a life sentence. So you can be on the periphery and somehow have some culpability, but you're not the person that inflicts the killer blow. You didn't stab anyone, you didn't shoot anyone, so therefore you are not the actual murderer. And what happened after 2016 was the Court of Appeal decided that they'd take 10 test cases, and I think more or less all of the 10 test cases were cases supported by Jengba anyway. And we thought this was, we were going to get a resolution here. We were going to get people out of prison who shouldn't have been there. But the 3 judges on the panel on those 10 cases said that all of those convictions were safe and upheld all of them. It was only a few years down the line because we thought we'd won, we thought we had a victory. But it was only as time went on that we realised what the Supreme Court had done is they put what's called the substantial injustice test in place, which means before you go to the Court of Appeal, you must first prove your innocence. Now, I always thought you went to the Court of Appeal to prove your innocence, but it sounds about right, because like Roxy says, the prosecutor doesn't have to prove what he says, but you have to prove that he's wrong. Isn't that justice turned on its head? Didn't it used to be the other way around? That you were innocent until proven guilty? But what joint enterprise has done has turned that around. So the minute you enter the courtroom, you are guilty and you must prove your innocence. Now, if the evidence is so weak and so tenuous, how are you going to prove your innocence to take that back to the Court of Appeal? How do you bag up the possibility of foresight and put that in front of a judge and say, I didn't have that, Your Honour, it was somewhere else? It's an impossibility. And joint enterprise, I truly believe the concept of joint enterprise was used in this conspiracy case. My son was charged with murder. It was joint enterprise that found him guilty. In this conspiracy case, you were charged with conspiracy, but it was joint enterprise that found them guilty. So we need to do one of two things: reform or abolish, because the justice system and all of our MPs and politicians and the Supreme Court and the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the prosecutors that are still going out there using this technicality, it is a technicality, are not going to do anything about it. They're not going to change any of it. They're not willing to change it. And I also believe that many of the defence lawyers are either stupid, or they don't care, or they want to keep this in place. Because lots of prosecutors also defend, and it's going backwards and forwards. They're batting it back and forth, a law that they know is wrong, but it keeps them in the courtrooms earning money. Thank you.
Jen, thank you for that, and thank you for speaking so candidly and so openly. Our last speaker is Professor Ethne Quinn, the University of Manchester, who has got some slides to show. So she's going to go to the lectern to deliver her introductory remarks. And just to remind you, we do have time for questions at the end.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Is that okay? So I want to talk about rap music in particular, rap lyrics and rap videos, and how this music's used in criminal cases that are group prosecutions, in which there are a number of defendants swept into a single charge or tried at the same time, as we've been hearing about. And what I'll be saying complements some of the great reports and scholarship in this area. So this is now an important area legally and amongst scholars. Here are some of the highlights. There's a legal guide about how rap's being used in joint enterprise and conspiracy cases. There's excellent scholarship. So it is a moment when we're trying to, when there's a challenge being mounted by lots of people. So I just wanted to just put that out there to represent the excellent works. The use of rap evidence has become much more prevalent in the last 5 or 6 years. It's got a longer history. I first acted as a rap expert in a court case in 2008, or 2 court cases back then, soon after the publication of my book on rap music. I was asked to talk about the context and some of the lyrics by defense counsel in 2 cases in London. But there's been a surge of the use of rap evidence in the UK since about 2017. The vast majority of cases involving rap are group convictions. That's something we discovered when we did some research with a scholar at LSE, Abanar Olusoga, and a BBC journalist. And we found that it's a norm to have several young people in the dock for a single offence in cases involving rap. And overwhelmingly, the defendants are young black men and boys. The majority are teenagers at the time of the offence that they are indicted for. Now, you might think that rap is used as evidence only when the lyrics contain what looks like a clear confession or a clear motive for a specific offence, but that's simply not the case. Rap is much more often used as a kind of sinister mood music, often to construct a so-called gang narrative. Rap is supposed to tell us about defendants' state of mind, propensity to violence, and criminal associations. And this is something that scholars Patrick Williams and Becky Clark already mentioned from Manchester Metropolitan University have powerfully explored and critiqued, and their report was up there before. The state seizes on violent lyrics that are very fashionable in the music genres like drill. They play the rap in court. It readily creates a sense of threat, criminality, and nihilism. It's dehumanizing. For those unfamiliar with the music genre, it can call up powerful racial stereotypes about the young people in the dock. So in legal speak, rap evidence tends to be prejudicial. It invokes an emotional, knee-jerk response, and it's unduly detrimental to the defendant's case and the co-defendant's cases. The average number that we found in the 67 cases we looked at in cases where rap evidence is used was 3.5, but clearly the numbers can be much more significant as per the Manchester 10. When you combine the prejudicial effect and the loose ways rap's used to sweep young people into group prosecutions, you get a kind of evidence that can, in my view, be dangerously misleading. It can seem very relevant to the judge and jury when it's actually not relevant. That's not to say that rap's never relevant to an offence. Sometimes it can be. But the problem is rap can easily be construed to look very relevant when it's not. So an illustration is always useful. Let me give you an example from a joint enterprise murder case that I was instructed in on behalf of one of the defendants. There were 3 people on trial, so smaller than average, but still 3 on trial, no firm scientific evidence against any of them. Someone had been stabbed with a kitchen knife late at night during a brawl at a very busy house party in the kitchen. There was lots of confusion about what had happened. Here's the rap lyric prosecution was mainly focusing on in relation to my defendant. It was found in the notes section of his mobile phone among lots of verses written by himself and saved several days after the incident. I had devilish thoughts when I witnessed a body get chopped. He got splashed, he got chefed, we didn't say shit. Now this is a drill lyric, and as I've said, drill tends to have very violent content. That's something that's without question. In its focus on violence and weaponry, in fact, it has a lot in common with the gaming culture that's also very popular among young men and boys. So what did prosecution claim that this lyric meant? They said it shows a violent mindset and serves as a kind of confession of involvement in assisting the stabbing. And a lot of emphasis was put on this lyric because, as I said, there was hardly any other evidence against this individual. Now, it might seem compelling. I'm not sure how it strikes you at first blush. But let's look more closely at the lyric. I make 3 quick points to close out my talk, which all open outwards to capture broader problems with using rap, especially in group prosecutions. Now, the first is a general point. Prosecution presented this lyric as a kind of diary entry. In general, prosecution asks juries to see the rap as personal testimony, as factual, and rap does have autobiographical components. But in fact, as young people know, but grown-ups tend not to, rap's mainly fictional and formulaic and fantastical. In fact, in this case, the rap lyric, On the Phone, was part of a track that went on to have commercial success, something prosecution didn't mention, and that would have interrupted their narrative about it being a confession. The actual motive for writing it was to do with artistry and to do with commercial success, enterprise. Those frames are removed, and instead a criminological lens is imposed on the lyric. The state almost always asks for violent lyrics to be taken literally in these cases to try to solidify the case against all the defendants. Second point then, I want to zero in on that first bit of the lyric, I've had devilish thoughts when I witnessed a body get chopped. Okay, prosecution's reliance on this lyric serves to show how loose and nebulous joint enterprise laws are for secondary parties in murder cases. There was no suggestion that this young man had stabbed anyone himself, but the fact that he might have had these devilish thoughts when he witnessed something was enough for the lyric to be seized on as hard evidence that he himself was a murderer. As Jan was saying, up for a life sentence. And a life sentence means that you serve all the years that you're given, right? So that, there's no early release. That's not true if it's not a murder conviction, but in murder cases, you serve all the years. So he was up for this, based mainly on this lyric. Prosecution's contention was that the lyric supported their case, that he was close enough to the victim to see him attacked, and this suggested he was part of the attack. That was in the prosecution's opening note. It's actually an incredible leap of logic. Even if we took this lyric literally, who hasn't had devilish thoughts? Is thought a crime? Is witnessing something the same as participating in it? This speaks to the terribly speculative nature of joint enterprise and conspiracy prosecutions for secondaries, for those who are drawn into charges with no evidence or little evidence, and even there's no allegation that they actually have committed harm, as Jan was saying about her son. And in that space of speculation, racist and class stigmatizing stereotypes fester and amplify. And this is just onto my final point now. And this is where it gets even more crunchy. Let's look at the full lyric again. Actually, that's an interesting one that also turned out that this guy on his phone had saved a very similar lyric. I've had devilish thoughts since I witnessed a body get dropped 2 weeks before the incident, right? So one wonders how the police and prosecution could claim that it was a confession. And again, that was elided, that was omitted. But it was there in the big transcription the police had made of his lyrics and the translation they'd had done. When we look at the lyric again, it seems loosely to match the incident in that there is mention of a stabbing. But look more closely, and we see those 3 dots in the middle of it. What did prosecution strip out of this line? They deleted a number of lines. Ooh, it's a bit low, I don't know if it's behind our panelists. They deleted a number of lines that didn't correspond with the incident. The missing lines were a shopping list of gun references, yet firearms had absolutely no role in this brawl. So prosecution had spliced lines together to help make the lyrics look relevant to the incident. This raises all kinds of questions about the authority vested in police who deliver this rap evidence in these cases at trial, including the Manchester 10, which we could go into later. What is the authority on which police speak? Have they got the expertise? Have they got the neutrality to be serving as experts in these cases? Have they got the neutrality? This particular point is raised in this example. It also shows what pains the state can go to try and drag people into charges against whom they have hardly any evidence. And the question has to be, why? And we've already heard some suggestions of answers to that are very disturbing, but compelling. So to conclude, the use of rap music as evidence, I would argue, is fueling the injustice we're looking at today. It's one component. There's more than rap in these cases, in these gang constructs, in these joint enterprise cases, in these conspiracy cases against young people. It targets the young, it targets working class people, and overwhelmingly it targets young black people, including children. It's bad law and it's got to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ethne. The cases we're talking about, as Ethne's just said, race is an element in many of these cases. Could I just turn to Roxy and ask, this is a particular law, but taking place within a system that is not neutral when it comes to race. How does race play a role in these cases, and in the Manchester 10 in particular?
That's a huge question. I mean to say it's huge because it's like it is the epitome of why it's even happening, race and racism. I mean, the fact that some of these boys are even on police radar is due to some of the things that we've said before about them being stopped and searched in the community, about being more likely to be arrested. So it helps build the construction. So by the time it gets to court, there can be another narrative about the boys that exist there because they've experienced stop and search, because they've experienced arrest, because they are black. It plays a narrative it plays a role in some of the things that we see used in court that actually we're given the impression that actually the police and government really want to support young people on, but they don't at all. So, for example, two of the boys, in fact, in this case, were certainly victims of drug exploitation by older adults. Now, that was brought into the courtroom because they wanted to build up a gang narrative completely, but these were very young boys who were sent elsewhere to distribute drugs, known in the media as county lines, but it's a problematic narrative that was definitely created to kind of bolster the police, the same kind of gangs and drugs policing. But they were never seen as victims. And that is because they are young black boys. So police are saying that they want to protect and support victims of this kind of drug exploitation. But when it gets to court, those young people who are experiencing that are seen as criminals. And that is because we see all young black people often in those settings as inherently criminal. It's key to the case because if these boys were making, well, we know that rap music, we know that drill music is seen as inherently violent and is seen as a gang activity. That's what that became in court, and that can only really work with black boys. You know, if it was white boys rapping, you might see, and it's difficult, this one, because I don't always want to use this case as an example because I don't believe any young people should be in prison. But in the Yusuf Macky case, some of the boys in that were kind of, the narrative was that they were pretending to be gang members, which is very different to what these boys had when they were kind of chatting rubbish on this Telegram message when they were, without a doubt, gang narratives. And that is because of their blackness and how society views that blackness, and particularly white society. I don't think I've answered the question because race and racism feels so inherently true to exactly why they're there in the first place. But it just runs through everything.
I think you've exactly answered the question. Nazir, could I turn to you? This idea of association, I think what we presume when we hear about association is that everybody is present when a crime is committed. It can mean something very different, and it means something very different in the Manchester 10 case.
Very much so. I think I said earlier on that you don't have to be in the room to be part of whatever the enterprise that they're suggesting. So in examples that I've dealt with, you've got a getaway driver who's not in the room. You've got people who've maybe cased the joint who've not in the room, but they're just as guilty as the people who are in the room. So I can see how that operates. Do you mind, David, if I try and address a couple of things that have been issued? Because Jan made the point about the defence solicitors. I'm not a defence solicitor, I never have been, but actually I stand up for defence solicitors. They're doing their very best without any of the resources they need. You probably don't know this, but in order to get an expert evidence, they have to go to a legal aid board to get the money to get an expert. And of course, the legal aid board can say, oh no, you don't need an expert, etc. You know? So there's a bit of not a level playing field here. I don't think defence experts do themselves a lot of favours in not speaking up about these issues, but the point is I think they could do more. And I think the issue that was raised about expert evidence, there's no reason why police officers can't be experts. I mean, if they've been dealing with something for 30 odd years, that's fine. But there ought to be other experts, just like you were, giving evidence which will give a jury a different story or present a different version of the facts, which I think is something that's perhaps also lacking in the system. And I think when I was listening, I was very disturbed by what I'd heard. These are not cases that I'm familiar with, but I was very, very disturbed by what I was hearing. It strikes me, to put it bluntly, David, this is lazy prosecution, lazy investigation. Because I can point to loads of examples where I didn't rely upon a video. I got undercover officers in there recording the conversations with the individuals. I managed to get all sorts of surveillance evidence. You know, so we built, together with the police, a really strong case against perpetrators based on their own words, with evidence that would stand up in front of a jury, etc. Ultimately, they would plead guilty because it was so strong. But here, they're just being really lazy. You know, rather than doing what good police work should be, they're simply relying upon, as we've just heard, something taken out of context or not at all. For heaven's sake, I watched West Side Story of the weekend. That's about the Jets and the Sharks. Does that make me a gang member? You know, or if you read Shakespeare, does that make you, keen on multiple murder? You know, it doesn't. And I think it's just laziness on the part of the authorities. You know, before I came here, on the way here, I was reading the guidance, because prosecutors operate on guidance, which is nationally available, publicly available on their website. And it talks about things like prosecutors should be careful when relying upon. Prosecutors should be mindful. But clearly they're not being, are they? And they're simply jumping on a proverbial bandwagon, which ultimately leads to the kinds of miscarriages of justice we've heard. So I think we need to highlight it, as you are doing today, but that's not going to change. For all the phenomenal work that Jengba have been doing, it didn't change the world with the Supreme Court. And I'm afraid this government are not going to change anything. So what we need to do is present the strongest case to demonstrate that actually this is not the way we do things, and we should be doing things. It's all about fairness, and clearly there's no fairness here. And I think I'll take away from this, I think I need to do more on this subject, because quite frankly, I chair Andy Burnham's Violent Crime Summit strategy. So I'll go away and have a look at whether we can do something there. But I think evidently this is just laziness, which has led to terrible miscarriages of justice.
Thank you very much for that. It seems, if I may venture, that laziness is of course part of it, but the laziness might, to an extent, be said to be motivated by the potential for certain forms of evidence to weaponize stereotypes that exist about young black men. Is that what's happening with drill music and drill videos? That there is the potential, the easy weaponization of those videos because those stereotypes exist within our society?
Yeah, absolutely. So, really, the police just find it so easy, and it's opportunist. It's now been sedimented as practice. It's been codified, in many cases, we've already had mention of the fact there's a complete asymmetry of arms between the prosecution, who can always field a police officer to speak to not only the rap lyrics, but the related, the kind of digitalized materials which they put together. And the more defendants you have, the greater that you can plunder the digital lives of a bigger group of people. I understand in the Manchester 10 case, irrelevant stuff to do with drug dealing was brought in, and so you end up just finding, straddling lots of different kinds of gang narratives, and the whole gang narrative is so racist and toxic. And so you pull in different bits of it, And as Roxy was saying, the jury is really primed, not only because, as Nazir said, juries, have their own biases, but those biases are invoked in the courtroom, and they're invoked and they aren't challenged. And defense counsels often are not doing the job. They are often prosecutors as well as defense. Some are doing a great job, but they are so under-resourced, and there is a profound asymmetry which goes against fair trial rights fundamentally, where, as I was saying, it's a really important point that the police, with their body of evidence, which can be a certain kind of in-field expertise, are always there. They're always ready to be fielded as rap experts, as image experts, as hand sign experts, as colours. We've heard about the blue and the red, and they can make these claims, and often it's not rebutted. There's no defence expert, and the defence counsel are often prosecutors anyway, so they know the police, and they don't know actually. Even if they're, with the best will in the world, they don't have the expertise themselves. And so there's silence, there's no rebuttal, and then the jury then believes every word, because what else would you do if there's no rebuttal? And then you've got a nice soundtrack from a drill video with masked up young men or something to accompany that. It's case closed. That's the real danger, and it's very shocking.
Thank you very much for that. In 2021, MP David Lammy described joint enterprise as, quote, shoddy law, and he went on to say, it's outdated, it's backwards. How can you be in custody for years and years when you weren't anywhere near a crime? How can you be in custody if you simply withdrew from a crime that was being committed? How can you be in prison because you were in the park but nowhere near the murder that was being committed? That is the kind of justice that is being done in the name of joint enterprise, and it has to end. Nazir just said that the prospects of it ending don't seem very bright. Jan, can I ask you, what is the next step? What tools do you have, and those who support you have, to keep fighting against these laws and the way they're being implemented?
Hope. Yeah, it's got to end. We've got hope. As a campaign at the moment, we're kind of fighting two prongs of it now. Those that were convicted under the wrong interpretation of the law are still serving life sentences, even though, the highest judges in the land said it was wrong, but they're still serving life sentences. So we've got a private members bill at the moment that has to go through Parliament, it has to get to the House of Lords, and it has to get passed, because otherwise all of those people who are serving life sentences for not committing murder will never get acquitted. And when we're talking about that the law changed but it didn't have any effect.
This was in 2016. In
2016. It has had an effect on some people. I've been told by some defence lawyers that some young people have, because they've had a robust challenge in the courtroom from their defence, that they've had the case thrown out either at the beginning or midway through, or they've been charged with murder but they've ended up getting convicted of a much lesser offence or even acquitted. So with the right legal team, and I know I said about defence lawyers not being very good, but some of them are not very good. Some of them are incredible, and the ones that I know are just out of this world. So I'm not saying it's all of them, but I have been told that the change in law has helped people. And I'll never know who they are because they don't come to me. No one comes to me until they've been found guilty of murder that they haven't committed, which is good because I never want to meet them. So we have done something, and campaigning and shouting about this does work. So we have to keep doing it. We have to keep recognising that little chip that has made a little bit of progress, needs to be a bigger chip to make the progress that we need. So for the people that were already convicted, the fight is to get them acquitted. And then on the other side of it, we need to speak to our MPs, we need to speak to the people who can change the law, but it isn't a law. This is the thing, it isn't a law. There are so many laws in legislation out there that can be used. And there are so much, there are ways of the only thing that joint enterprise is a way of prosecuting and convicting people on the most tenuous of evidence. And when we're talking about gangs, the last I heard, it wasn't illegal to be a gang member. So it's not a crime to be in a gang. It's only a crime to be in a criminal gang. So I can't understand why prosecutors want to bring this, oh, you are in a gang. I mean, the gang phrase and the gang narrative was used in my son's case, and it was sort of, the judge actually said, you can't keep using this phrase. I mean, to us it was too late, but I think that was on the basis that the 5 defendants were all white boys, and it started to sound a little bit ludicrous. You know, we don't have gang members in Cinnamon Brow, it's too nice for that. Was that the reason why they did that? But I went to the trial of the 10 boys, the Manchester boys, and let's remember as well, that courtroom has just been built for £3 million, and it's called a gang court. You know, beware Manchester, you know, they're coming for you, especially if you're a young black kid, they're coming for you. And I listened to what the prosecutor was saying and the way that the phrases that he used. And I've been in trials, lots of trials, and I've heard it all before, and it blows my mind to think that these jury members are sat here and they're finding these young people not guilty of the actual crime. They're guilty of being in a gang. They're guilty of being black. How dare they be black and be in a gang and listen to drill music? And it's just, you would never get a middle-aged man and his friends taken to court because they go to the opera at the weekend and their taste in classical music being thrown into the courtroom and to be judged by that. I just think music should never, ever enter a courtroom. And if that is all a prosecutor has, then the judge in the first instance should say, I'm sorry, but this isn't enough evidence, and he should throw it out. And, you know, where has the authority of the judges gone? Because they're letting this trickle through. And if joint enterprise is case law, which is sort of case law made by the judges and made by the jury who say guilty or not guilty, then we need to put some integrity back into that courtroom and say to the judges, if the evidence isn't enough, regardless of whether it's from the police or the CPS, it has to be thrown out. We can't keep putting people in prison for telegram messages, for thoughts or possible thoughts. And no one should be found guilty without intent. No one should be found guilty of murder unless they have intent. And in a joint enterprise case, all they have to prove is that the principal had the intent. The burden of proof for the others is less than the principal. So they're the ones who are going to prison for life without intent. And for the history of the legal system, as long as I've known, you don't go to prison. You don't get convicted of murder unless there is intent. Unless, of course, you throw joint enterprise into the equation.
Jen, thank you very much. We've only got about 10 minutes left. We have to finish at 4 o'clock. I want to make sure that the audience have a chance for questions. Please raise your hand and we'll get do we have a mic to get to people? Gentleman here at the front. And please be brief if you can.
Yes, so my question, I guess it doesn't work now. Hello?
You seem to have the capacity anyway.
Yeah. So my question was more a comment and the question. The comment was to Nazir about the lazy from prosecution. I actually don't think it's lazy. I think it's purposeful, and it's been proven that when they're tampering with evidence of the lyrics, so they're only showing certain lyrics. So that's not lazy. That's very purposeful. What's your comment on that?
I don't know the circumstances, but yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that the example that you were given, where certain words were taken out of a particular sentence, there can be only one reason for that, which is to satisfy their case. But again, it comes down to, rather than do a proper investigation, I'm going to try and use these lyrics to demonstrate intent and cut out the stuff that doesn't support my case. So I think it's still lazy. I think it's simply a case of people not doing their job properly. I'm a strong believer. I don't believe in conspiracy as much as I believe in incompetence. I think what we're talking about is incompetence. Oh, absolutely. Once you get the case into court, you hope the jury will convict, which I think is Jen's point, actually. Judges aren't doing their job. Judges should be throwing cases out left, right, and centre.
And then my question is how we shift the balance and how we get a criminal justice system that serves us all when ultimately it's very
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the case. I've met the family. Yes, it's a class issue. Yes, it's we do things the way we've always done things issue. Yes, it's a race issue. It's all of those things. It's intersectional. Of course, it's all of those things. I have a big answer, which I was discussing earlier on, around the judiciary is not fit for purpose. You have to be 50 years old before you become a judge. I want 30-year-old judges. I want judicial profession to be a separate, standalone profession, so young people who understand how young people operate and live should be able to become judges. And I think that's one way of dealing with it. The diversity of the judicial profession. 1.8% of judges are from black and minority backgrounds. That doesn't in any way represent the Britain that we have now. So there's some significant changes that need to happen, some of which will be highlighted in next week's report, I know. But I think the reality is that I'll go back to my point. We can't tinker just with joint enterprise. We can't tinker with the way perhaps witnesses are done. We need a complete root and branch review of how the justice system operates, and I'm happy to do that for you.
Can I just add quickly, what are we going to do? Well, at the moment, Jengba are taking legal action against the Crown Prosecution Service on the basis that we say they are racist. They say they're not, we say they are. For the last 10 years, we've been asking for data, and they've refused to give it to us. So unless they give us the data, they are going to court.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, can I take some more questions? I'd like to get to as many as we can. There's a gentleman there. Can we get a mic to him? Please do. Sorry, could you say that one more time, please?
It was about what role the media narrative plays.
Can I ask Professor Quinn to comment on that?
It's just massive. You know, the media is absolutely one of the major elements. So just to give you a very quick example from that case that I was talking about, that in the national news, the headline was, at the start of the case, based on a press release from the police, was rapper murders someone, or, you know, says prosecution or something, says at the bottom, but rapper murders, you know. Now, because as Jan's saying, people don't know what joint enterprise is, and they don't know what conspiracy is. So when they hear murders, they think there's a weapon. They think, I don't know, they think there's forensics. They think this guy is the principal, right? Or he's alleged to be the principal. There was no circumstantial evidence. So that just shows you the extent to which, right at the start, it's hand in hand, really, very often. And so the media is driving up this agenda in a really dangerous way.
Thank you very much. There's a lady there with a hand up, please, and grey top.
Roxy, you talked about the systematic failures of the grieving boys. What would care have looked like? And can police officers who've been proven to be institutionally racist give neutral evidence in court? I would say they can't.
So Roxy first.
Yeah, so I think what care would have looked like for the boys is having a society where the root causes of what led them to do what they do or put them in the environments that they might have been in catered for. You know, these boys lost a friend in a very traumatic way. Some of them witnessed that. And that wasn't something that was part of their lives before. But they're dealing with this trauma. We needed trauma support on the ground. We needed the boys, when they first chased someone at Hopwood Hall College, not to be excluded from that college before any actual harm happened. If they were brought in at that moment, two of those boys, we could have prevented everything that came if they were given detached support, emotional grief support. If we understood what was going on for them, we could have prevented harm. And like I said, you know, there were boys who, one of the boys in this case, he was homeless, living on the streets in Piccadilly Gardens. He found an adult and learned how to deal drugs because he needed drugs. He needed to make money to survive, and he couldn't find a job because it was COVID. These are all structural harms that we need to be focusing on. I don't think the focus is on how we fix this system because it's unfixable. The focus is on all of the things that sit in the environment and that are all the failures that are happening to our young people in their lives that we really need to build the infrastructure for: grief support, emotional support, trauma support for those experiencing cycles of trauma, housing. All of these things are like imperative to preventing harm in our communities.
Roxy, thank you very much.
The second question was about whether officers who've got a finding of institutional racism can give evidence in these cases. That's the important word, finding. So they've had to be disciplined internally and then allowed to carry on working. Their record is disclosable. So that the other side, the defence, will know that this person is institutionally racist, but it doesn't automatically ban them from giving evidence.
Thank you very much. There's a lady here in the front. Could we get a mic to her, please?
Hi, it's a question for Roxy, first about the evidence you talked about. I'm trying to get my head around how the evidence got in. Was it through bad character evidence with the drugs and the conversation that they were having in the background, or how did that get in? Was it?
Yeah, so with I find it amusing that we say that police are under-resourced because like 20 officers came to each kid's for like just their phone. But essentially, the harms that we talk about, I've spoken about, that are in the timeline, those were on CCTV. Now, when those boys were found, the boy 1, 2, and 3, I think their phones were taken at arrest. That's when they then kind of took all the information about the Telegram, their Instagram account, Snapchat, and started to do that kind of mapping. In terms of the drug stuff, I think that was bad character testimony, but it was also in some cases brought in by defence. Sorry, I know I need to be quick, but because one boy, for example, was out of the area at part of the indictment period. One boy's lyrics were when he was at a young offenders institution. He wrote them there, supervised by someone who worked there, but those were still used in court. So in some ways, the defence also brought some of that stuff in. But largely what happened here is the boy got rid of his phone. He then got a new phone, but he then downloaded everything from his old phone. And they used all of the images and everything on that from his first arrest. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's just,
sorry.
Yeah. And I also wanted to ask the panel about what they think should be done to the appeal system, because even if the bad character evidence is deemed to have been wrongly made admissible in the trial, if it goes to appeal, the conviction can still be found to be safe. So what do you think should be done to that appeal system? Because nothing happens when you appeal these things either. So it's just a constant cycle of miscarriages of justice. So
I'm very sorry to say we're not going to have time for that question. We have a hard finish at 4 o'clock. This is a conversation that I can feel the urgency in the room that needs to happen. I need to say thank you to the panel. I need to say thank you for their honesty, their openness, their expertise. Please join me in thanking Professor Ethne Quinn, Roxy Lagan, Jan Cunliffe, and Nazir as well. And thank you for coming. This is evidently an issue that we need to return to. This is evidently an issue that is sadly not going to go away. I hope we can pick up this conversation at another time. Thank you for coming and for being part of this discussion.